Sarah Martinez had dreamed of soaring through clouds since she was 7 years old, watching fighter jets streak across the desert sky above her grandmother's house in Arizona. 23 years later, that same dream lay shattered on the cold marble floor of the military recruitment office. The words "Dynade" stamped in red ink across her application felt like a dagger through her heart. But sometimes, life has a strange way of opening doors when you least expect it. Sometimes, a single glance, a moment of recognition, and an old colonel's sharp eyes can see beyond the rules that others blindly follow. What Sarah didn't know that gray Tuesday morning was that the small tattoo on her neck, the one that had caused so much trouble, the one that made officials shake their heads and push her file aside, would become the very thing that would change her destiny forever. This is the true story of how prejudice, persistence, and an unexpected encounter transformed not just one woman's life, but challenged an entire system that had forgotten what true courage really looks like. Sarah Martinez pressed her face against the cool glass of her grandmother's kitchen window, watching the silver jets paint white trails across the endless Arizona sky. At 7 years old, she didn't understand the complex physics of flight or the years of training required to pilot those magnificent machines. All she knew was that she wanted to be up there, dancing among the clouds, free from the gravity that kept everyone else bound to the earth below. "Mija, come eat your breakfast," her grandmother called from the stove. But Sarah's attention remained fixed on the distant aircraft. Each morning brought the same routine, jets from the nearby Air Force base conducting their training exercises, and Sarah positioned at that same window, dreaming of the day she would join them. Her fascination wasn't just a childhood phase that would fade with time. As Sarah grew older, her passion for aviation only intensified. She devoured every book about flying she could find at the local library, memorized the specifications of different aircraft, and studied the biographies of famous pilots. While other teenagers spent their allowances on clothes and makeup, Sarah saved every penny for flying lessons at the small municipal airport 30 miles from her home. By 18, she had earned her private pilot's license, becoming the youngest person in her county to achieve that milestone. Her instructor, a gruff former military pilot named Jake Henderson, often remarked that he had never seen anyone with such natural instincts for flying. Sarah possessed an almost supernatural ability to read the wind, to feel the subtle changes in her aircraft's behavior, and to make split-second decisions that kept her safe in challenging conditions. But natural talent alone wasn't enough to fulfill her ultimate dream. Sarah wanted more than weekend flights in small civilian aircraft. She wanted to serve her country, to push the boundaries of what was possible, to fly the most advanced military jets ever created. The path forward seemed clear. She would join the Air Force and work her way up through the ranks until she earned her wings as a fighter pilot. However, life had other plans for Sarah Martinez. During her senior year of high school, she made a decision that would haunt her for years to come. Caught up in the rebellious spirit of her teenage years, and wanting to honor her late grandfather, who had served in World War II, Sarah got a tattoo. It wasn't large or offensive, just a small design on her neck featuring a pair of wings wrapped around her grandfather's military service dates. To her, it was a meaningful tribute to the man who had first sparked her love of aviation with his stories of flying transport planes over the Pacific. When Sarah walked into the Air Force recruitment office 6 months after graduation, she was confident, prepared, and ready to begin her journey toward becoming a pilot. Her test scores were exceptional, her physical fitness was outstanding, and her knowledge of aviation was impressive. Everything seemed perfect until the medical examination revealed her tattoo. The recruitment officer, a stern-faced sergeant with 20 years of service, shook his head disapprovingly when he saw the small design on Sarah's neck. According to military regulations, visible tattoos were not permitted for officers, and pilot candidates faced even stricter standards. Despite Sarah's protests that the tattoo could be easily covered by a uniform collar, the sergeant was unmoved. "Rules are rules, young lady," he said, stamping "Dynade" across her application. "The military has standards to maintain. Perhaps you should have thought about the consequences before you made that decision." Sarah left the recruitment office that day feeling as though her world had collapsed. The dream that had sustained her through years of study and preparation now seemed impossibly out of reach. She spent weeks researching tattoo removal procedures, only to discover that the process would take months or even years, with no guarantee of complete success. The specific location and colors of her tattoo made it particularly difficult to remove completely. Refusing to give up entirely, Sarah decided to explore other branches of the military. She visited Navy recruiters, hoping their regulations might be different, but encountered the same inflexible policies. The Marines were even more strict, if such a thing were possible. Each rejection felt like another nail in the coffin of her aviation dreams. For 2 years, Sarah worked at a local aviation maintenance company while she underwent painful and expensive laser tattoo removal treatments. The process was slow, costly, and emotionally draining. Some days, the physical pain of the laser treatments seemed minor compared to the psychological anguish of watching her dreams slip further away with each passing month. During this difficult period, Sarah threw herself into learning every aspect of aircraft maintenance and operation. She earned additional certifications, studied advanced aviation technology, and even began working toward a degree in aerospace engineering through night classes at the local community college. If she couldn't fly military aircraft, she reasoned, at least she could understand how they worked better than anyone else. Her co-workers at the maintenance facility often commented on her exceptional skill and knowledge. Sarah could diagnose problems that stumped mechanics with decades of experience, and she had an intuitive understanding of aircraft systems that seemed almost magical. Pilots who brought their planes in for service often requested that Sarah personally oversee the work, trusting her expertise more than that of more experienced technicians. Yet, despite these professional successes, the pain of her unfulfilled dream never fully disappeared. Sarah would still pause in her work sometimes when military jets flew overhead, that familiar ache in her chest reminding her of what might have been. She had developed into exactly the kind of skilled, knowledgeable, and passionate individual that the military needed, but a small piece of ink on her skin continued to stand between her and her goals. The tattoo removal treatments had made some progress, but the original design was still faintly visible under certain lighting conditions. Medical professionals warned her that complete removal might not be possible, and even if it were, the process could leave scarring that would be just as problematic under military regulations. As her 21st birthday approached, Sarah faced a difficult decision. She could continue the treatments, spending more money she didn't have and enduring more pain for uncertain results, or she could finally accept that her military aviation dreams were over. Friends and family members had begun suggesting that she focus on civilian aviation opportunities, pointing out that she could still have a successful career as a commercial pilot or flight instructor. But Sarah Martinez had never been one to accept defeat easily. The same stubborn determination that had driven her to earn her pilot's license as a teenager, that had sustained her through 2 years of rejection and painful treatments, refused to let her abandon her dream completely. She decided to make one more attempt at military service, but this time with a different strategy. Instead of hiding her tattoo or apologizing for it, Sarah would be completely honest about her situation from the beginning. She would present herself not as someone trying to sneak past the regulations, but as a qualified candidate who deserved consideration despite having made one youthful mistake. She would let her skills, knowledge, and passion speak for themselves, and hope that someone in the military hierarchy would be willing to look beyond the surface. On a cold Tuesday morning in November, Sarah walked into the recruitment office for what she had decided would be her final attempt. She wore a simple white blouse that clearly showed her neck tattoo, carried a folder full of her certifications and achievements, and prepared herself for what she expected would be another rejection. She had no way of knowing that this day would be different. She couldn't have predicted that a chance encounter with a visiting officer would change everything, or that her tattoo, the very thing that had been holding her back, would become the key to opening doors she never imagined possible. As Sarah approached the receptionist's desk that morning, she took a deep breath and prepared to tell her story one more time, unaware that her long journey through frustration and disappointment was about to take a dramatic and unexpected turn. The recruitment office buzzed with its usual morning activity when Sarah Martinez walked through the glass doors for what she had promised herself would be the final time. 3 different sergeants sat behind their desks, each engaged with potential recruits, while a handful of young people filled out paperwork in uncomfortable plastic chairs. Sarah had memorized every detail of this room during her previous visits: the faded motivational posters on the walls, the scuffed linoleum floor, the persistent smell of coffee and industrial cleaning solution. What she didn't notice immediately was the older man in dress blues standing near the back wall, quietly observing the daily operations. Colonel Marcus Thompson had arrived early for a scheduled inspection of recruitment procedures, part of his ongoing efforts to identify and address persistent problems in military personnel acquisition. At 62 years old, Thompson had spent 4 decades in the Air Force, rising through the ranks from a young enlisted mechanic to one of the service's most respected senior officers. Sarah approached the same desk where she had been rejected multiple times before, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. Sergeant Williams looked up from his computer screen with barely concealed irritation when he recognized her face. "Miss Martinez, we've been through this before," he said without waiting for her to speak. "Your application has been denied multiple times. The tattoo policy hasn't changed, and it's not going to change. I suggest you look into civilian aviation opportunities." "Sergeant, I understand the policy," Sarah replied calmly, pulling out her folder of certifications. "But I'd like you to review my qualifications one more time. I've completed additional training, earned new certifications, and I believe my skills demonstrate the kind of dedication and capability the Air Force needs." Williams barely glanced at the documents she placed on his desk. "Ma'am, I don't care if you can fly the space shuttle. You have a visible tattoo on your neck, and that disqualifies you from officer candidacy. Period. End of discussion." The conversation was proceeding exactly as Sarah had expected, following the same script as her previous rejections. She felt the familiar surge of frustration and disappointment beginning to build, but she forced herself to remain professional. Behind Williams, she could see other recruiters shaking their heads sympathetically, as if to say they wished they could help, but their hands were tied by regulations. What none of them had noticed was that Colonel Thompson had moved closer, drawn by the mention of aviation qualifications and the obvious passion in Sarah's voice. For several minutes he stood silently behind the group, listening to the exchange and observing Sarah's demeanor. Something about her reminded him of himself 40 years earlier. The same desperate hunger for flight, the same refusal to accept defeat even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. As Sarah began to gather her papers, preparing to leave for the final time, Thompson stepped forward. His movement was subtle, but the immediate change in the room's atmosphere was unmistakable. Every sergeant and recruit suddenly stood straighter, conversations died away, and all attention focused on the distinguished officer with silver eagles on his shoulders. "Sergeant Williams," Thompson said in a voice that carried quiet authority, "I'd like to review this young lady's file." Williams' face went pale as he suddenly realized a full colonel had been observing his interaction with Sarah. He quickly pulled her folder from the rejection pile, his hands slightly trembling as he handed it to Thompson. Sarah stood frozen, uncertain whether this unexpected intervention would help or hurt her situation. Thompson opened the folder and began reading in silence, his experienced eyes quickly absorbing the details of Sarah's background, test scores, and qualifications. What he found impressed him greatly. Here was someone with exceptional aptitude scores, extensive aviation knowledge, and a genuine passion for serving her country. The only black mark in her entire file was the small tattoo that had derailed all her previous applications. After several minutes of review, Thompson looked up at Sarah for the first time, making direct eye contact. It was then that his gaze fell on her neck tattoo, and everything changed. The colonel's sharp eyes focused on the small design with sudden intensity. Unlike the recruiters who had dismissed it as a rebellious decoration, Thompson immediately recognized the military significance of what he was seeing. The wings wrapped around service dates weren't just random artwork. They told a story of family service, of respect for those who had come before, of connection to military tradition. "Miss Martinez," Thompson said quietly, "tell me about this tattoo." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words might determine her entire future. "Sir, it honors my grandfather, Technical Sergeant Miguel Martinez. He flew transport missions in the Pacific Theater during World War II. Those dates mark his years of service. He died when I was 15, but his stories about flying inspired my love of aviation." Thompson nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Technical Sergeant Miguel Martinez, the name was familiar to him. As a young officer, Thompson had made it his business to study the history of his service branch, particularly the contributions of Hispanic servicemen who had often been overlooked in official records. He remembered reading about a transport pilot named Martinez who had been decorated for flying dangerous supply missions to isolated Pacific islands under enemy fire. "Your grandfather flew C-47s out of Henderson Field," Thompson said, watching Sarah's eyes widen with surprise. He completed over 200 combat missions, including several behind enemy lines. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross and 2 air medals. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. In all her research about her grandfather's service, she had never been able to find detailed records of his achievements. The family had preserved some photographs and a few medals, but the specific details of his wartime service had been lost over the years. "Yes, sir," she whispered. "He never talked much about the war, but he told me stories about flying over the islands, about the beauty and danger of it. He said the sky didn't care about your background or your language or your skin color. It only cared whether you could fly." Thompson closed the folder and looked directly at Sergeant Williams. This young woman's grandfather was a war hero who risked his life repeatedly for his country. She carries a tattoo honoring his service, not as an act of rebellion, but as a tribute to military tradition. Her qualifications are exceptional, her test scores are in the top percentile, and her knowledge of aviation exceeds that of most academy graduates. The room had gone completely silent. Everyone present could sense that they were witnessing something significant, though none of them yet understood exactly what was happening. "But sir," Williams began hesitantly, "the regulations clearly state—" "I know what the regulations state, Sergeant," Thompson interrupted. "I also know that regulations should serve the military's mission, not prevent it from acquiring the best possible personnel. Sometimes exceptional circumstances require exceptional decisions." Thompson turned back to Sarah, studying her face carefully. He saw determination, intelligence, and genuine dedication, qualities that could not be taught or faked. He also saw something else that reminded him powerfully of his younger self, an absolute refusal to let obstacles destroy dreams. "Miss Martinez, are you prepared to commit to 8 years of active duty service, including whatever training and assignments the Air Force deems necessary?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Are you prepared to uphold the highest standards of professional conduct, to lead by example, and to prove that my faith in you is justified?" Thompson made a decision that would later be studied in military leadership courses, as an example of how senior officers could use their authority to overcome systemic obstacles. He took out his own pen and wrote directly on Sarah's application folder. "Sergeant Williams, I want you to process Miss Martinez for Officer Candidate School immediately. I am personally endorsing her application and taking responsibility for this decision. If anyone has questions about the tattoo waiver, they can direct their concerns to me." The impact of Thompson's words was immediate and electric. Williams scrambled to pull out the proper paperwork, while other recruiters whispered among themselves about the unprecedented nature of what they had just witnessed. Sarah stood in shocked silence, barely able to believe that her years of rejection and disappointment were finally over. But Thompson wasn't finished. He had seen something in Sarah's file that went beyond her basic qualifications, something that suggested she might be capable of more than standard military service. "Miss Martinez, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want an honest answer. What is your ultimate goal in the Air Force?" "Sir, I want to be a fighter pilot," Sarah said without hesitation. "I want to fly the most advanced aircraft we have, and I want to serve at the highest level possible." Thompson smiled for the first time since entering the office. Here was someone who didn't just want a job or even just a career. She wanted to excel, to push boundaries, to achieve something extraordinary. These were exactly the qualities the Air Force needed in its pilot corps, especially as the service faced increasing challenges in recruiting and retaining top talent. "Very well," he said. "I'm going to recommend you for direct entry into our accelerated officer training program with a follow-on slot in pilot training. This is not a guarantee. You'll still have to prove yourself every step of the way, but you'll get the chance you've earned." As Sarah left the recruitment office that day, her head was spinning with the sudden reversal of fortune. In the space of 30 minutes, she had gone from final rejection to acceptance into the most competitive programs the Air Force offered. The tattoo that had been her greatest obstacle had become, through an incredible series of circumstances, the key to opening doors she had never dared hope might swing open. But Sarah's journey was just beginning. The road ahead would test every aspect of her character, skill, and determination. She would face challenges that would push her to her absolute limits, encounter people who questioned whether she truly belonged in their ranks, and discover strengths within herself that she never knew existed. What she couldn't know yet was that Colonel Thompson's decision to look beyond regulations and see the person behind the tattoo would have consequences far beyond her own career. Her success would eventually force the entire military establishment to reconsider policies that had excluded qualified candidates for superficial reasons, opening doors for countless others who deserved the chance to serve their country. 8 months after that life-changing morning in the recruitment office, Second Lieutenant Sarah Martinez stood on the flight line at Columbus Air Force Base, staring at the T-6 Texan trainer that would either make or break her aviation dreams. The sleek white aircraft gleamed in the Mississippi sun, its single turboprop engine representing the first step toward her ultimate goal of flying fighter jets. The journey to this moment had been more challenging than anything Sarah had ever experienced. Officer Candidate School had tested not just her physical endurance and military knowledge, but her mental resilience and leadership ability. She had graduated second in her class, earning the respect of instructors who had initially been skeptical about the colonel's unusual waiver decision. But pilot training was an entirely different level of challenge. Of the 25 officers who had started the program with her, 3 had already been eliminated for failing to meet the stringent standards. Every day brought new tests, new obstacles, and new opportunities to prove whether she truly belonged among the elite ranks of Air Force pilots. Sarah's flight instructor was Captain James Rodriguez, a former F-16 pilot with over 2,000 hours of combat time. Rodriguez had a reputation for being tough but fair, and he had volunteered to work with Sarah partly out of curiosity about the woman who had received such high-level endorsement. He wanted to see for himself whether Colonel Thompson's faith had been justified. "Martinez," Rodriguez called out as Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection. "Are you ready to see what you're really made of today?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Today's mission would be her first solo aerobatic flight, a crucial milestone that would determine whether she could continue toward fighter training. Rodriguez watched carefully as Sarah strapped herself into the cockpit, running through her checklist with methodical precision. Her movements were confident and practiced, showing none of the hesitation that plagued some students at this stage of training. When she fired up the engine and taxied toward the runway, her radio communications were crisp and professional. As Sarah lifted off and climbed into the clear blue sky, she felt the same surge of joy and freedom that had captivated her since childhood. But this was different from her early civilian flying experiences. This aircraft was more powerful, more responsive, and demanded a higher level of skill and attention. Every control input had to be precise. Every decision had to be instantaneous. The aerobatic sequence she had to perform included loops, rolls, and inverted flight maneuvers that would test her spatial orientation, her ability to handle G-forces, and her overall piloting skills. As she began her first loop, pulling the stick back and watching the horizon disappear above her head, Sarah felt completely in her element. The aircraft responded to her inputs like an extension of her own body, and she maintained perfect control throughout the challenging sequence. From the ground, Rodriguez watched through binoculars as Sarah executed each maneuver with remarkable precision. Her loops were perfectly round, her rolls were coordinated and smooth, and her recovery from inverted flight was textbook perfect. After 18 months of training dozens of student pilots, Rodriguez could immediately recognize exceptional talent, and what he was witnessing was truly exceptional. When Sarah landed and taxied back to the flight line, Rodriguez was waiting for her with an expression she couldn't quite read. As she climbed down from the cockpit, still energized from the flight, she tried to gauge whether his silence was good or bad news. "How do you think you did up there, Martinez?" Rodriguez asked. "I felt good about it, sir. The aircraft felt responsive, and I was able to maintain altitude and heading throughout the sequence. I think I stayed within the required parameters." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "You think you stayed within parameters? Lieutenant, you just flew one of the most precise aerobatic sequences I've ever seen from a student pilot. Your altitude control was perfect, your airspeeds were exactly on target, and your form was better than some instructors I know." Sarah felt a surge of relief and pride, but she tried to keep her expression professional. She had learned during her months of training that overconfidence could be just as dangerous as lack of skill.
But, Rodriguez continued, technical precision is only part of what we're evaluating here.
The real question is whether you have the judgment, the decision-making ability, and the mental toughness to handle combat situations. Tomorrow, we're going to find out. The next day brought Sarah's first simulated combat mission, flying against an experienced instructor pilot who would try to shoot her down using training rounds and sophisticated computer simulations. This exercise separated the truly gifted pilots from those who were merely technically proficient. It required split-second decision-making, aggressive maneuvering, and the ability to think tactically while under extreme pressure. As Sarah climbed into her T6 that morning, she noticed other students watching her with expressions of curiosity and some skepticism. Word had spread about her unusual path to pilot training, and there were whispers about whether someone with her background could really compete at the highest levels. The tattoo that Colonel Thompson had seen as a mark of honor was viewed by some of her peers as evidence that she was different, possibly less committed to military standards. The combat simulation began at 15,000 feet, with Sarah and her opponents starting several miles apart. When the exercise commenced, she immediately put her aircraft into a climbing turn, trying to gain altitude and position herself advantageously. Her opponent, Major Patricia Chen, was a veteran of over 100 combat missions who knew every trick in the book. For the first few minutes, Chen seemed to have the upper hand, using her superior experience to maneuver into attacking positions. But Sarah quickly demonstrated that her thousands of hours studying fighter tactics and her natural flying ability made her a formidable opponent even against a combat veteran. She used creative defensive maneuvers, aggressive counterattacks, and innovative tactics that caught Chen by surprise. The simulated dogfight lasted for 20 minutes, with both pilots pushing their aircraft and themselves to the limits. Sarah pulled G-forces that left her vision graying at the edges, executed maneuvers that required perfect timing and control, and made decisions in milliseconds that would have taken other students much longer to process. When the exercise finally ended, Chen had managed to achieve a simulated kill, but only after Sarah had forced her to work harder than she had expected. More importantly, Sarah had demonstrated the kind of aggressive, intelligent, and skillful flying that marked her as potential fighter pilot material. After landing, Chen sought out Rodriguez to discuss the flight. "Jim, that Martinez kid is something special," she said. "I've flown against a lot of students, and I've never seen anyone with her combination of natural ability and tactical thinking. She made me work for that kill, and there were moments when I thought she might actually get me instead." Rodriguez nodded. He had been watching the radar tracks of the engagement and had reached similar conclusions. Sarah's performance was not just good for a student, it was impressive by any standard. Word of Sarah's exceptional performance began to spread throughout the training command. Instructors who had never worked with her started paying attention to her progress, and her fellow students began to view her with new respect. The questions about her background and her tattoo didn't disappear entirely, but they were increasingly overshadowed by recognition of her obvious talent. As the months of pilot training continued, Sarah consistently performed at the top of her class. She mastered formation flying, navigation, and instrument procedures with the same precision she had shown in her aerobatic work. Her academic performance was equally impressive, demonstrating deep understanding of aircraft systems, weather theory, and flight planning. But perhaps most importantly, she showed the kind of leadership qualities and unflappable demeanor that the Air Force sought in its pilots. When other students struggled with challenging concepts or became frustrated with difficult maneuvers, Sarah was often the one who helped them work through problems and maintain their confidence. Colonel Thompson, who had been quietly monitoring her progress through regular reports from the training command, was pleased but not surprised by what he was hearing. He had recognized something special in Sarah from that first meeting, and her success was validating his decision to look beyond surface appearances and regulations. The culmination of pilot training came with the assignment of aircraft tracks, the moment when graduates learned whether they would fly fighters, bombers, transport aircraft, or other specialized planes. This decision would determine the entire trajectory of their military careers, and competition for fighter assignments was intense. When the assignment list was posted, Sarah's name appeared next to F-35A Lightning II, one of the most coveted assignments available. She would be going to Luke Air Force Base for advanced fighter training on the Air Force's newest and most sophisticated combat aircraft. As Sarah stood looking at the assignment list, surrounded by celebrating classmates, she thought about the long journey that had brought her to this moment. The rejections, the painful tattoo removal attempts, the years of doubt and frustration, all of it had led to this incredible opportunity. Captain Rodriguez appeared beside her, smiling broadly. "Congratulations, Lieutenant. You've earned this assignment through exceptional performance and dedication. But remember, this is just the beginning. F-35 training will be even more challenging than anything you've experienced so far." "I understand, sir," Sarah replied. "I'm ready for whatever comes next." 3 years later, Captain Sarah Martinez made history as the first Hispanic woman to lead a combat mission in the F-35 Lightning II. Her exceptional performance in combat operations over hostile territory earned her the Distinguished Flying Cross, the same medal her grandfather had received 70 years earlier. The small tattoo on her neck, now barely visible after years of partial removal treatments, had become something of a legend within the Air Force. New pilots often heard the story of how a colonel's recognition of its true meaning had opened doors that regulations had kept closed. Sarah's success had led to a comprehensive review of military tattoo policies, resulting in more flexible standards that allowed thousands of qualified candidates to serve their country. Colonel Thompson, now retired, often spoke at military leadership seminars about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize true potential. He would tell audiences about a young woman whose tattoo told a story of military tradition and family service, and how nearly missing that story would have cost the Air Force one of its most exceptional pilots. Sarah's journey from rejected applicant to combat pilot became a powerful reminder that sometimes the most unlikely paths lead to the most extraordinary destinations. Her grandfather's legacy, carried in ink on her skin, had ultimately opened the sky to her dreams and changed an institution that had forgotten the true meaning of service and sacrifice.